Hello, everyone. Hello. We're going to start a little bit early today to give our speakers plenty of time to address the group. I really want to welcome you today. I think this is a very important topic, and I'm just thrilled that we have the experts and the people in the room that we do to share in this conversation. Our next meeting on November 9th will be right here, and our speaker will be Detroit Mayor Duggan talking about the new Detroit. So I hope you can join us then as well. Today we have some special guests in our audience. We have Michigan Supreme Court Justice Robert P. Young Jr., Michigan Supreme Court Justice Stephen J. Markman, Michigan Court of Appeals Judge Mark T. Boonstra, Michigan Court of Appeals Judge David Sawyer, Kent County Circuit Court Judge Paul J. Sullivan, and U.S. District Court Judge Robert Bell. I'd like you to give them a round of welcome. Today, we have with us three very prestigious gentlemen, and I would like to introduce Doug DeVos, who's going to do a brief introduction. Thank you. Have a great lunch.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and in front of all the judges, I'm even more nervous, as well as in front of our panelists that are here, but it's a very interesting topic as we talk about decriminalization and as we look at our criminal justice system in maybe a new or refreshed way. Just a couple things maybe to set the stage. We have, the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the populations of people that are incarcerated. The question really kind of before us is, as we look at it as a total, are things working the way we want? What are the ramifications? What's really happening? And when you have 65 million Americans that have a criminal record, what does that mean to us as a country, as a society, and for our future? Does it really do what we want it to do? Is it reducing crime, improving safety? Is it achieving the goals and the results that we look forward to? Or is it having some unintended consequences that we haven't thought through completely? And while the topic may seem a bit removed, just one quick story of how it comes close to us. As we operate in markets around the world, we are part of the legal system where different countries have different laws. You may have been aware that our CEO in Amway, India, was incarcerated for 2 months. That business practices that were challenged by the police gave them the right to take his freedom. And when they took his freedom, that made Steve and I and all of us at Amway unbelievably angry, frustrated, and with a sense of helplessness. As we talk about these topics today, it's hard for us to put ourselves in those places. We were able to garner resources. We had the best lawyers we could find. We were looking after his family, and we were caring for him as the best we could as we were advocating for his position and his freedom. The battle still goes on today, even though that started over 2 years ago, or over a year ago. But even today, that battle goes on. For all this topic, all of us in this room probably aren't too worried about it personally. It's not something that you think about in your future of being part or being caught up in the criminal justice system, but there's a lot of people in our community who think about it. A lot of families who contend with what happens when they're in that situation. So we felt it was an important topic to bring up as we connect the criminal justice system to our business community, our economic community, to our community in general, the overall health of our community and what it means for our future. Because we tend to believe in people. We believe that people are there to be developed and that their strengths and talents are to be developed and can be used productively in our community. And so often some of those strengths and talents get caught up and aren't able to be used. So we got a great panel that is here to talk about it much more eloquently, but I just wanted to kind of set it up a little bit for you. First, we have Mark Holden here, who is the general counsel from Koch Industries, who has been very active in the public sector of dealing with these issues, been very active. As you know, the Koch family and the Koch Industries are very connected to a lot of public policy issues and debates. So, Mark, we're honored to have you here. He's been very involved in law, has been with Koch for over 20 years. We also have Edwin Meese III, former Attorney General, who served with Ronald Reagan, who is currently connected with the Heritage Foundation, continues to be involved there with them. He is also on the board of the Federal Society for Law and Public Policy Studies, and served obviously as our Attorney General for our country. And we have Jeff Rosen from the National Constitution Center. Jeff is going to kind of moderate a bit of the conversation for us today, take us through it, as the National Constitution Center it continues to look at this issue from all sides. He's a contributing editor for the Atlantic Magazine. He's a senior fellow at Brookings and highly regarded author, and he has a new book coming out next year. So this is a panel that is uniquely qualified for this task. This is a panel that, as soon as they arrived, started conversation and is very interested in having the conversation with all of us. And it's our hope that as we go through this panel in this time, that we'll all have a different perspective or have different information, new information, and think about a topic perhaps in a new way, and understand that as a society, it's our role to shape this policy. We elect the people who make the laws, and we support the people who enforce the laws, and we want to make sure that we do it in a thoughtful and proper manner. So with that, if I could ask our panelists to find their way onto the stage, and if I could ask all of you to give them a welcome as they find their way here. Gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Doug. And it's great to see you, ladies and gentlemen. Doug, the passion that you showed in describing the injustice done to your employee in India is the same passion you've shown every day in sharing this national treasure, the National Constitution Center. And all of us are so grateful to Doug DeVos for his leadership in helping us pursue our inspiring bipartisan mission of promoting constitutional conversation and debate. I'm honored also that other National Constitution Center board members are here, including Hank Meyer and Derek Roman, and it is great to be here in Grand Rapids. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot wait to begin this conversation because you have before you two of the most distinguished lawyers and authorities on this topic of over-criminalization in the United States. And you have a topic that in these polarized times miraculously seems to be uniting the left and the right about the importance of reform. And that's why I have to just tell you one beat about the National Constitution Center's role in bringing together people who ordinarily disagree from the left and the right and everywhere in between for constitutional conversations. The National Constitution Center is a beautiful building on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, right across from Independence Hall. It has the most beautiful constitutional views in America. We have rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights. But the National Constitution Center is more than that. We believe that in these polarized times, there should be one place that brings together people who disagree to debate and celebrate and learn about the one document that unites us, the greatest document of human freedom in history, the US Constitution. And we're doing that by having events like this across the country. We have a series of traveling town hall debates, of which this is one, which are co-hosted by the Federalist Society, which you heard General Meese is on the board of and was founded by people who worked for him, and the American Constitution Society, which is the liberal counterpart on the other side. In Chicago in a few weeks, we're going to debate whether or not the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms. And it is thrilling to see people who ordinarily disagree have civil constitutional debates on these topics. I also need to ask you, I'm going to give you homework because I'm a law professor as well as the other things that Doug mentioned. Go online and check out our exciting new interactive constitution, where the heads of the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society have nominated scholars to write about every clause of the Constitution. And you can read what they agree about and what they disagree about. And the College Board has just agreed to make this phenomenal tool the centerpiece of the new advanced placement history and government exams. We want to bring it to every student in America, but it is literally a model of civil discourse and of seeing the right and the left disagree. Ladies and gentlemen, this conversation began on April 13th last year for an event that we are holding every year called Freedom Day. And we invited the most distinguished thinkers on the left and the right, including the heads of the leading think tanks in America, to come and debate and celebrate the meaning of freedom. And I had the honor of meeting Mark Holden, and he was on a platform with the head of the ACLU. And you don't ordinarily expect the ACLU and the Koch brothers to be agreeing, but to my tremendous surprise, I heard them not only agreeing, but working together to fight this scourge of over-criminalization. And then I heard about Mark's moving story that you're about to hear about in a moment. And I thought, I really want to take this show on the road and persuade people around the country about the importance of this debate. And then we were so honored to have General Meese, really one of the most distinguished public servants in our history, who's so thoughtful about these issues and has also made over-criminalization a crusade and is speaking out eloquently about it. So that's why this conversation is great, and let's get right to it, because we just have so much to talk about. Mark, you have a moving personal story. When you were a kid, you worked in a prison, and that affected your views. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. On behalf of Koch Industries and Charles and David Koch, it's a very important issue to all of us, all Americans, regardless of political party affiliation, ideology. The criminal justice reform and the criminal justice system impact all of us in many profound ways. And to Jeff's question, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and Worcester is a great place. As someone told me a long time ago, it's probably my father, it's a great place to be from. But I always loved it growing up. And when I was in college, I went to the University of Massachusetts, and to pay for college, I worked in the Worcester County House of Correction. And that, until I went to law school, was the best job I ever had. Probably says more about the other jobs I had. They were all good jobs too, but this was the best one because it was like, I think $5.50, $6 an hour, and that was high cotton back then. So when I was working at the prison, it was interesting to me, and it's really stuck with me until this day. And we have a lot of different reasons we're involved in the criminal justice reform movement. I won't go into all of them right now, but from a personal perspective, what I saw there were a number of kids that I grew up with that I kind of lost track of in junior high. They were in the same neighborhood, went to the same church, same schools, all those types of things. And then when I started to work at the prison, I saw them again, and they weren't working as guards. They were incarcerated. They were inmates. And, you know, a number of them basically started out with drug problems, and it graduated from beyond that to more serious crimes for some of them. One in particular has got a life sentence now. He killed someone when he was high on drugs. But, you know, there were a lot of these, most of the people in the prison where I worked, it was, Worcester is a working class town. It was really poor people who were pretty much uneducated and got hooked on drugs and then made a bunch of really poor decisions. I'm not saying poor, pitiful them, they need to be let out, but they just made some bad decisions. And what it really made me think about is what Brian Stevenson, if you know who he is, he's in the criminal justice reform movement, kind of a leader. It made it proximate to me because I saw what happened to them, and it could have happened to me because really the only thing I could see, the only difference between me and them in a lot of ways was my parents. They didn't have family support, they didn't have the family structure, they didn't have someone who, and I did step out of line, kicked my butt. And I was more afraid of my parents in a good way than I was of anything else. And it helped me keep the straight and narrow, and fortunately was able to work hard and fortunately able to work for a company like Koch. So early on that kind of taught me that our criminal justice system, and this was in the 80s when a lot of the drug stuff was starting, and really, you know, the laws were getting ramped up on it. It really, in a lot of ways, I think we have the greatest system in the world, but we've seen now 30 years later or so that we've probably over-collected a number of people who probably could have benefited from something different, like maybe drug rehab or vocational training or something different, a different path. And we've turned a lot of people who we might be mad at to people we're afraid of over time. And there's been a lot of different adverse consequences, unintended consequences because of that. But for me, early on, it taught me just that, you know, there before the grace of God go I. And at the end of the day, as one of my friends who's a prosecutor in Wichita, Kansas said, none of us are necessarily innocent, we just haven't been caught yet. And I'm not talking about violent criminals or murderers or anything like that. It's just we're going to talk more about the number of laws we have in place and the way they're enforced and who they're enforced against more often than not that lead to some of these outcomes. So that really, for me, from an early age, got me thinking about this issue.
Fascinating. General Meese, you, when you were Attorney General, led a war on drugs. No one could accuse you of being soft on crime, and yet you gave a commencement speech at Seton Hall recently where you decried over-criminalization and said it was a serious problem. Tell us what happened between the 1980s and today that led to the explosion of all these laws, and why do you think it's a bad thing?
Well, basically, what we have had in this country is, as you point out, an explosion of laws. And it seems to me that if we're going to figure out ways to make the criminal justice system more fair, more humane, more effective, we ought to find out what we can do, starting with the laws themselves. And one of the things that has happened is we have so many laws at the present time that affect people, not those who have committed what we might call traditional crimes like murder, rape, robbery, that's burglary, that sort of thing, but we have laws that now can trip up innocent people who would never think of spitting on the sidewalk or even worry about parking violations. And so that really is what has happened. Today in the United States, now this is just the federal system, today we have something like close to 5,000 different statutes that have a prison as a potential penalty. It's interesting that when we started a little over 2 centuries ago, there were only 3 major federal laws: piracy, counterfeiting, and treason. Today, that has ballooned up to, as I say, nearly 5,000, so that there are all kinds of things that can go wrong where a person might not even know they're violating a law. Beyond that, most people don't realize, although perhaps many business people in this audience do because they may have even had experience with it, we have so many federal regulations that carry criminal penalties. There's so many. In 1998, I was chairman of a task force set up by the American Bar Association to look at over-criminalization. And we asked how many different regulations are there and laws for which you could go to prison. And the Congressional Research Service couldn't find them all. They said, we don't know how many, but we do know we think there are about, at that time, about 4,000 on the statute books. But even there, they couldn't find them all because they were hidden away, not just in the crime statute, the Title 18 of the Federal Code, which has most crimes, but they were in the Agricultural Code, they were in the Health and Safety Code, they were scattered all over. Then beyond that, there are now some 300,000 regulations that carry criminal penalties. And these are not enacted by Congress. These are enacted by bureaucrats in the various agencies of the federal government. You know, the Code of Federal Regulations is 80 volumes and 18 volumes and something like 80,000 pages. So that the estimate of 300,000 is probably a low estimate. But the whole idea is that we have all of these ways in which people could violate laws without even knowing them. One of the authors who's studied this has a book that's entitled 3 Felonies a Day, which was his estimate of how ordinary business people could run afoul of the law. Perhaps exaggerated. It should have been maybe 3 misdemeanors a day, but nevertheless, it illustrates how the law is being used in a way that was never intended. There are many ways in which you can take care of health and safety problems without putting people in jail, particularly when there's no intent to either violate the law or to do harm to the community. And so that's why I've been very much involved in this idea of over-criminalization. At Heritage, we kind of pioneered this with help from the Koch Foundation, and we have a number of things that we think needs to happen. But the first thing ought to be Congress ought to stop passing criminal laws unless they're absolutely necessary, and we ought to make sure that they don't allow bureaucrats to be passing regulations with criminal penalties attached.
Mark, I want to ask in a moment why it's bad for business, because we have to persuade our audience that it is. But to me, and I think others, it came as a surprise that the right and the left were suddenly focusing on over-criminalization. Why is this happening now, and what happened between the 1990s when the Clinton-era crime bill passed and vastly expanded the number of crimes, and today that made liberals and conservatives take a second look?
Well, I think that from my perspective, to answer your question, what's happened between the 1990s and today, I mean, I think that times have changed. I think that anybody in any business or personal relationship over time has to reevaluate what they're doing. If you're in a business, you're doing the same thing you're doing for 25, 30 years. Maybe it's working great, maybe it's not, but you always look at things and try to tweak them. I think what we've seen over time, to General Meese's point about the number of laws that are on the books that people may not even know are criminal behavior, and then other acts that, yeah, maybe they are criminal, but do we need to be so punitive about it? We've seen our prison population, as Mr. DeVos mentioned in the intro, we have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population. We spend $250 billion a year on the criminal justice system from beginning to end. We spend $80 billion a year on incarcerating people in this country, and that's 3 to 4 times more per capita than we spend on educating people in this country. And at the federal level, estimates vary, but you've got a huge part of the prison population. There's 2.2 million people in prison in the United States all in. About 200,000 or more are in the federal system, and estimates are anywhere from 40% to 50% deal with drug offenses, and not necessarily violent drug offenses. So I think that we're looking at the financial costs of that, but then there's also the societal costs. 1 in 3 adults in this country have some type of criminal record, whether it's felony, misdemeanor, or even arrest. They can all have impacts on you. We have 1 in 100 adults thereabout are incarcerated. We have, between incarceration and supervised release, 1 in 31 adults in this country are some type of correctional control. We have 1 in 28 children in this country growing up without a parent because of incarceration. And I think we need to take a step back and look at what we've been doing for the last 30 years and why we've been doing it, because at the end of the day, going back to what I mentioned earlier, my experience in Worcester, Mass, it was a lot of really poor people getting caught up in the system, and I think that's continuing today. And I'm not saying they're without sin, none of us are, obviously, but at the same time, there are probably a lot of things we could be doing differently between diversionary programs or better education programs before anyone even gets in the system to avoid the costs, both fiscal and societal, because people who are incarcerated, once they get out, it's tough for them to find a job. They have the scarlet letter F on their chest, and when that happens, you can't get a job. You can't get usually any type of license. You can't get a loan for a business loan, student loan. You can't live with your family if they're in public housing. You can't vote. And in a lot of different ways, we've set up a system where we're over-collecting people again who maybe really never belonged in the system, and maybe they engaged in criminal conduct, but now the costs are much, much higher for us as a society when we can't seem to fund anything at all. And it would be nice, in my opinion, we see this as a moral, constitutional, and fiscal principled movement. What would be nice is if, and the moral side is obviously, in my opinion, I think that we have a two-tier society in our justice system where if you're wealthy and connected, you're probably going to be okay, and if you're not, you're going to get a bad deal. Guilt and innocence can become irrelevant. So if we could save some money on this, maybe we could fund our schools, maybe we could fund mental health programs, maybe we could fund drug treatment programs, maybe we could give tax refunds. And I think it's all of us are in this, to your point, left and right. The left has engaged with us in a way they haven't in the past. Groups that traditionally attacked us for political reasons now want to work with us because they understand we believe in this movement. We believe in it because we are classical liberals. We believe in a limited government. We believe in expansive individual liberties. The Bill of Rights, 4 of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights deal with criminal justice issues. And we believe that before anyone has their life, liberty, or property taken from them in this country and their pursuit of happiness taken away, it needs to be a very serious offense, and we should use the least amount of force necessary to require people or to get people to comply with what we want. And now we seem to be over-solving for it, over-sentencing, over-incarcerating. And that's what we would like to see fixed. And so does the other side of the left as well, and that's good.
Well, you were doing inspiring work. You talked about the moral and fiscal issues. When you say constitutional issues, of course, my ears perk up. Ladies and gentlemen, you have on your tables thrilling National Constitution Center pocket constitutions. And you can open them up and try to identify the 4 amendments that Mark mentioned that deal with criminal justice. Mark, have I got them right? We have the 4th Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. We have the 5th Amendment, which guarantees due process of law. We have the 6th Amendment, which has certain criminal trial rights, including the right to confront witnesses and the right to counsel. And then the 8th Amendment dealing with bail. And of course, there's the 7th, which with civil jury trials as well.
And the First Amendment, which allows us all to talk about it freely, which
Beautiful,
is great.
beautifully said.
Yeah.
And well, you're going to have to stop me, but in fact, at the heart of the American Revolution was a concern about criminal and civil justice issues, the king breaking into the colonists' desk drawers and looking for evidence of anonymous pamphlets denouncing them. So this is at the core of American history and our Constitution, and we've got to deal with it on all levels. But General, before we get too far into the Constitution and the solutions, we've got to convince this audience that it really is bad for business. So why should the Grand Rapids Economics Club care? Why is over-criminalization bad for business?
Well, the first reason, of course, is that virtually anyone here could conceivably be a victim of all of these laws. If there are 300,000 laws out there or regulations, any one of you might be a victim of prosecution for something you had no idea was a crime. And so that's one of the reasons why it's wrong. The other thing is the fact that you could be prosecuted not once, but at least twice for the same offense, because we have an overlapping jurisdiction, and the same things that have always been handled by the local governments, by states, and our violations of state law, unfortunately, too often, Congress will pass exactly the same law and make it a federal law. And since these are 2 separate jurisdictions, the idea of double jeopardy in the Constitution doesn't apply. And so you can be prosecuted for the state court, in the state court for a crime, and then you can be acquitted of that, and then if you have a vindictive prosecutor at the federal level, you can be indicted and then convicted conceivably for that crime all over again. So there are various reasons why we need to carefully look at what the criminal justice system is doing and avoid the opportunities where someone never intending to commit a crime can be in fact convicted and literally sent to prison. At the same time, I think it's important that we do the kinds of things that Mark is talking about in a proper way so that we don't increase crime. We're looking for reductions in crime. And we're looking at ways in which our prison systems can do a better job of rehabilitation. In California, they'd call it the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And quite frankly, up until now, there's been very little correcting and virtually no rehabilitation in prisons. And so that's one of the things that needs to be looked at. We also have to look, I think, at the history, because there is a good reason to have strong criminal penalties for very bad behavior, including repetitious behavior. The most serious criminals are called serious repeat criminals or serious repetitive criminals, and these are the ones where most of the serious crimes are involved in committing. What's not generally known is that we have had tremendous success in the last 20 or 25 years in reducing crime in the United States. The peak crime was really in the years 1979, 1980. And the reason for that is that starting around the late 50s and early 60s, there was a tremendous leniency in our criminal justice system. And almost nobody went to prison, no matter how serious their crime may have been. Obviously, murderers went to prison, many armed robbers, but many repeat offenders were let out very early. And so that situation persisted on into, as I say, into the 70s, so that we had between 1960 and 1980 a 300% increase in crime in the United States. In 1968, for the first time, it was a presidential issue in the presidential elections. Gradually, in the end of the 1970s, state legislatures representing the views of the people were fed up with this vast increase in crime, and so criminal penalties for serious habitual offenders were increased. And it may be in some cases, as Mark has suggested, that some legislatures went too far, but overall, that was a very desirable thing to do from the standpoint of the law-abiding citizen. And so we had these definite increases in penalties, but decreases in crime that started during that period of time. And so crime went down in the early 80s. Mid-80s, the crack epidemic hit the big cities, and crime went up slightly. And once the drug abuse problem was dealt with more effectively, as it was in the 1980s, starting around 1990, 91, crime started to go down again. In the year 1980, there were 25,000 criminal homicides in the United States. Today, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000. So you're actually less likely to be murdered in the United States today than you were some 30, 35 years ago. So that was an important thing to do. But as Mark has suggested here, we need to look now to see what are the offenses that where we can look about perhaps lowering some of the penalties. But particularly, how do we look at the whole system? How do we look at what people do in prison? If people are going to prison and just laying around in the yard, or for a while they had these muscle building programs there where they gave them weights to strengthening their muscles, improving their overall health. But what you had was people getting stronger in prison, so when they got out of prison, they could commit strong armed robberies. This was not a very good idea. So today we have something that we call smart on crime. How do we use our brains to figure out how do we do things in prison that will turn people out better, not worse than when they came in? And secondly, how do we keep them from coming back? And that's something that Mark suggested in his remarks and which I feel very strongly about. The important thing to do is to make sure that we utilize the thinking that reduced crime in the 80s and the 90s, and that we keep that going, and that we do a better job of those who are going to prison now so that they're not coming back.
Great. Well, we have a lot to talk about in terms of the reform moving forward, but Mark, I think we really have to convince the audience, why is it bad for business, and in particular, why have you joined with the Obama administration in supporting laws passed by a number of states called Ban the Box, which prohibit employers from asking about the criminal history of employees when they apply for jobs?
Yeah. So Koch, and just to be clear, we think every employer needs to make their own call on what's best for their workforce, their needs, and that type of thing. We do not believe that it should be compelled that you ban the box, as they call it. And what that means is, on the application itself, there's typically a box that says, check here if you've ever had a criminal conviction. And then people check there, and oftentimes that went into the circular file, as they call it, and that person never was considered potentially for a role. We banned the box at Koch, and we've been moving away from it for the past several years, and it officially this year we took it off our application end of last year, and we weren't planning to talk about it, but then some of the groups that we're working with heard about it and said it would be important for us to get our voice out there on it, so we talked about it more publicly. And really, at the end of the day, what happened for us was, you take a step back to General Meese's point and to Mr. DeVos's point, although it was India, but the same thing, the over-criminalization of sometimes ordinary corporate behavior in the regulatory world can lead to criminal penalties. And at our company in the late 90s, 4 of our employees in our refinery were indicted, 97 counts, for alleged environmental crimes and conspiracy and things like that. And it was really a situation where our employees found a compliance issue, self-reported it, told the regulator we're going to fix this, did fix it, reported back, thought we moved on, then I won't bore you with all the details, but things kind of spun out of control. And really what it was is back to the 5,000 or so, we really don't know for sure, federal criminal laws out there. We have prosecutors who were upset. Some of our outside lawyers didn't do a great job building a relationship, which is never a good idea. You don't want to anger a prosecutor unnecessarily, and they did. But a lot of other things happened, and our employees were indicted, and they were facing, these were all alleged nonviolent first-time offenders, anywhere from 5 to 40 years in prison. Now, ultimately, the case went away. They were exonerated. The company pled guilty to the issue. We had originally self-reported and fired someone for engaging in a false report 6 years earlier, and our employees had to sign waivers not to sue the government for malicious prosecution. And we found out after the fact, a lot of skullduggery in the grand jury process. A key document was altered by someone, not us, a document that was really showing we did the right thing from the beginning was changed to read differently and made it look like we didn't do the right thing. And that led us to start to look at the process, the criminal justice system. This was back about 12, 13 years ago now. And it really, if it was happening to a big company with a lot of resources that could stand by their employees, what's happening out there to the average person, small business owner, you name it. And that got us involved working with General Meese and the Heritage Foundation and the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. So that's one piece of it. We learned there are a lot of imperfections in our criminal justice system from that experience. And so what is criminal and what isn't criminal is not always easy to tell. Secondly, going back to the 1 in 3 adults in this country with some type of criminal record. We are a global employer, as I'm sure some of you here are, and we're also a national employer. We've got 60,000 U.S. employees, another 40,000 around the world. And we are fighting for the best talent possible. And so for us to, at the beginning of the process, before we've ever laid eyes on this person, know nothing about them other than they check a box, to exclude them from being able to work for us, it's not fair to them, but it's definitely not fair to us and our self-interest. We want the best people. And so what we've learned over time is we look at the application, we look at the resume, we have the person for a phone screen, we get to hear more about them, we meet the person through another interview process. And what we've found over time is people usually will bring up during that process that they have some type of criminal record in their past. And you know what, if they don't, we do a background check before we make a final offer, and we're going to find that out anyway. And what we've learned over time is that it's better to get to know the whole person. It's better to understand who they are today and what they learned from their past, rather than solely fixating and judging them on a point in time where they were probably a completely different person and probably did something really stupid and made a bad mistake. It's better for our company, it's better for them, and going back to all the points about if you can't get a job, you're likely to be a recidivist, and it's $30,000 to $40,000 a year to put someone up in prison. That kind of informed all of our decisions, and we've had great success hiring people who have criminal backgrounds. They're great employees. They made a mistake, and they work hard. They have great integrity. We've had really bad experiences with people who have perfect backgrounds, squeaky clean, best schools, that type of thing, great references. They lack integrity, and some of them have stolen from us. So we've learned from all of this that, you know what, let's just let this shake out, and we'll find out about what happened with the person as part of the process. And, at the end of the day, we'll make a decision based on the individual, our business needs, and the role. Are they the best fit, regardless of a mistake, or even if it was a mistake, something more serious in the past? That it's all based on that, and not to get too touchy-feely and that type of thing, because I'm really not. But but it really gets back to, again, there's Brian Stevenson. I'm going to quote him again. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And all of us are capable and worthy of redemption. Now, there's people who aren't going to get redemption in this life and may not get it beyond the prison walls, but we need to all keep that in mind, in my opinion, particularly the environment we're in now, particularly with a lot of the issues we're talking about in our criminal justice system resulted from poverty caused by a lot of different factors, won't get into, but some of it's lack of education, lack of opportunity. So it's worked for us. It's worked for a lot of other employers. I recommend you think about it if it could work for you. And we just think it would really help, because I've got a friend back in Wichita that runs a youth mentoring organization. He's an ex-offender who's turned his life around, doing amazing things in Wichita, Kansas, a young man at a time. And he has T-shirts that say on them, "Nothing stops a bullet like a job." Kind of sums it up. So.
General, what do you think of ban-the-box laws? And some people want to go further and prohibit companies from denying employment entirely based on certain categories of criminal history. Does that go too far?
I think it would go too far for the government to prevent people who feel it's appropriate. There are a lot of businesses where, as Mark pointed out, there may be reasons, particularly businesses that deal with young children, things like that, where you're subjecting yourself to tremendous lawsuits if you don't take certain precautions. And so it seems to me that this is another thing that the government should not make it a crime to put a box on an application saying, have you had a criminal offense? On the other hand, I think there are good reasons, as Mark has pointed out, why businesses can decide for themselves, and I think I would certainly encourage businesses where they feel that their total process, like the background checks that Mark mentioned, will find this out, but that you don't eliminate people initially from any consideration until you find out more about them and what the chances are. But I think, again, going back to what we discussed earlier, the best way to make sure that ordinary citizens, particularly people who are not interested in committing crimes, who wouldn't commit a crime, that they don't get enmeshed in the criminal justice system in the first place because of a law that shouldn't be a crime. And if there's one lesson I hope we can leave with the audience today is to do whatever you can with your legislators. And there's a task force on over-criminalization now in the House of Representatives and the Judiciary Committee, where they're trying to make some changes in this so we don't have a lot of laws on the books that can trip up the unwary ordinary citizen. So that's the start. And then from there we go to how we can improve things in our prisons and do the kinds of things that Mark has suggested here.
Great. Well, you mentioned this new bipartisan bill, the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act, pending in the Senate. It amends the sentencing regimes for drug offenses and prior convictions. It changes the 3 strikes rule. Mark, you've been heavily involved in the bill. First of all, tell us how this remarkable bipartisan effort came about and what are its major provisions?
Yeah, so it came about because left and right and center, all voices have come to the table, different viewpoints, different reasons for being there, moral, fiscal, whatever it might be, constitutional, have come to the table on all sides, and that's what will make things change in this country. It's, I don't know, I've heard it attributed to Everett Dirksen and to Ronald Reagan. You need to make them feel the heat and then they'll see the light. And what's happened here is, at the federal level, something that's actually been going on in the states for a number of years, and actually you here in Michigan are also looking at making some major changes, or maybe smaller changes that will be major to your criminal justice system. But in states from about 2007 forward, 24 or more states have made fundamental reforms to their criminal justice system. And it's involved what type of activities should be criminal, what should we do with someone who violates them? Do they go right into the system? Is there a diversionary program? Is there a way to put them in drug treatment or something else they might need? And then if they do go to the system, what's that process like? How are we sentencing them? To the General's point, General Meese's point about what's the prison experience, to his point, you need, if you're a prison, your job, your only job should be to make the person better on the way out than they were when they came in. And then if you're not doing that, then my opinion would be run it like a business, even if it's not a business. And those people would have to lose their jobs until they're doing the right thing and making people better and having programs in place. And then finally, the last piece is reentry issues, alleviating some of the burdens on people who have paid their debts to society, served their sentence, and want to reenter. It's in all our interest to keep them from going back and trying to lift some of these, again, government-imposed burdens on them when they reenter society. But the federal bill, so it's based on a number of different reforms that have worked in a number of states. And I'm not talking lefty states, I'm talking deep red states. I'm talking Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, Mississippi, South Dakota, and others. And basically, those states, to General Meese's point, very importantly, it's enhanced public safety. Crime rates are going down still, and violent crime rates aren't going up. And then it's also saving money, because you're reducing incarceration rates. And it's also reuniting people in their families, getting back together, giving them a second chance. So you got reduced spending, reduced incarceration rates. It's really a great situation. And I think now what's happened in the states is coming up to the federal level is what we're seeing. And the bipartisan reform movement, and it came together because really when the Republicans took control of the Senate, there were already a number of good bills out there You've had, in the Senate side in particular, Durbin-Lee, the Smarter Sentencing Act. Not that I agreed with everything in it, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. And then there was Senator Whitehouse and Senator Cornyn, who had a corrections reform bill. And those two bills kind of got melded together under Senator Grassley's leadership. And Senator Grassley was very important, one, because he's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he was very much involved in a lot of the creation of the mandatory minimum statutes, along with many other, in a bipartisan way. So the bipartisanship's important now to fix it because it was created in a bipartisan way, going back to the 70s and the 80s, and then all the way up to the Clinton crime bill that Joe Biden still talks about. So these reforms, hopefully, they're going to give judges an increased safety valve for low-level drug offenders, street level or lower. Doesn't mean that they'll get off easy necessarily, but they can use discretion. They won't have to give them the highest possible sentence, and the mandatory minimums will be reserved as intended to the highest level offenders, violent offenders and drug trafficking, cartel leaders, that type of thing. There's also going to be a change to the 3 strikes and you're outlaw to make sure that someone who has a nonviolent offense doesn't get swept up into that, and reducing the tail end part of that sentence so it's not necessarily a life sentence. There are going to be reforms as well in the juvenile justice system, ending juvenile solitary confinement, only to be used in very rare circumstances, which is, I think, a positive thing, and then allowing for young offenders, juvenile offenders, to have their records expunged potentially. There's also going to be it's not necessarily going to be what General Meese was talking about, looking at all the federal laws and which ones should stay and which ones would go, but it's going to require all the different federal crimes out there in the books to be cataloged so we know what is out there. Regulatory crimes, drug crimes, violent crimes, financial crimes, and what intent standards are there. And then I think the next step will be making sure there are intent standards there, and then seeing what we do or don't need in the process. So that's what's coming through the Senate, and we think that's a very positive development. The prison reform part in particular, you're going to have all offenders, high level, medium level, low level, have the ability to get some faith-based help, some counseling while in prison now, vocational training, education programs. So when they come out, maybe they have something more positive to do than go back to that prior way of life. And there's going to be a hearing today in Senate Judiciary on this bill, and there's a markup, I understand, I think it's Thursday this week, so hopefully it gets through, passes the Senate, and then let's see what goes on in the House. There's also a bill there. There's a bigger bill called the Safe Justice Act that Sensenbrenner and Scott have put out. That's very comprehensive from beginning to end, probably too much for this Congress to do, but Chairman Goodlatte in the House Judiciary has a bill that deals with sentencing that's very similar to the Senate bill. And so hopefully in the House, there's some movement once they get their leadership issues worked out, and these bills can start to move through the House as well, and we'll get to the right place, get it on the President's desk, sign reform, and I think it'll be great. It'll be a good start, and we'll see where we go from there.
This is remarkable. Ladies and gentlemen, you thought Washington was broken and was not capable of meaningful, thoughtful reform. You've just heard of the most comprehensive reform effort of a generation, supported by Democrats and Republicans. General Meese, I have to ask you the question that I'm sure everyone is thinking about. Would President Reagan have supported this bill?
Well, that's a good question for this reason, and that is, as Mark mentioned, they're having one hearing on the bill, and I have some concerns because some of my friends in law enforcement feel that they've been left out of the process, and my own view is that we have to do it right. On very sensitive issues like this, where if you make a mistake, people will die or have their property stolen because of it. You want to make sure that you're doing it the right way. And I would be much happier if they had multiple hearings and made sure that law enforcement had an opportunity to testify to make sure that they're going the right way in this very complicated bill. One of the things that we saw in things like Obamacare and that legislation, where you're doing literally dozens, if not hundreds of changes in the law in a bill that's, 1,700 pages or something like that. Now, admittedly, this bill is better. It's only 140 pages. But there's two things about it. They're rushing it through without the adequate hearings because they do. As Mark mentioned, you have a number of different topics that are all put together in one bill. The second part of it is, once they have the markup, they will be encouraging people to vote on it very quickly, without the adequate hearings, and therefore, I don't think we need another bill that we pass to find out what's in it. And for that reason, I would be much happier if they were taking this much more slowly and looking at what's wrong and what's right in the bill if there are problems with it. The reason I say that is we've seen the states that have done some changes in their prison laws and their sentencing laws, and most of them, as Mark said, have done a good job of it, and they've done it right, and so crime is going down. On the other hand, we have one state that has done it exactly the wrong way, and that is they passed legislation to literally open the prisons without an awful lot of care. And as a result, California now has literally released thousands of prisoners. They've put the burden on local probation departments because they're no longer being handled by the State Department of Corrections. And as a result, crime in California, including violent crime, is going up. And you want to make sure that you do this carefully. And that's the one suggestion I have in terms of the legislation, which I agree with Mark. There are a lot of things in there. Let's make sure they do it the right way so we don't learn afterwards that it hasn't been done right.
Great, Mark. Why not do it more slowly? What's the response, and what does California teach us about how to do it wrong?
California teaches us a lot of things about how to do everything wrong, I think. So. I don't need to address that, do I? It's
That's fighting words, General.
Ipsa loquitur, I think it speaks for itself. I guess what I'd say, General Meese raises great points, and I think that there has been a lot of deliberation about maybe not this specific bill, but a lot of elements of it. As I mentioned, a number of the states have done this, and I think that I don't know how many people are going to be let out of prison. There's some retroactivity for the Fair Sentencing Act. That's the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. That was passed a couple of years ago, and that seemed to have been a positive result. People have been either not going into the system with reduced sentences, so they're going to make that retroactive now. I think that there has been probably a lot of deliberation, maybe not on this specific bill, but I know in the past two Congresses there have been over-criminalization task force that have looked at a lot of different issues, and I think that the sentencing reforms we're talking about, just giving judges an increased safety valve for certain low-level offenders, street level or lower, hopefully it doesn't lead to a spike in the crime rate or increased crime. We want to enhance public safety. And my sense is if it's worked in these states, excluding California, and it's more targeted and thoughtful and evidence-based, it'll also work at the federal level. I think that the federal level probably has more of the types of low-level drug offenders, street level and lower, than are incarcerated at the state level. My understanding in California is we want to avoid that situation where our prisons become so overcrowded. You have all these court orders and lawsuits and litigation compelling you to do something, and that's kind of what was the genesis of Prop 47, as I understand it. And I think in our situation, or the Senate bill situation, it's limited to the federal population, and it does seem targeted. And I think it's been thoughtful and deliberate, but with General Meese, I think law enforcement definitely, positively has to have a seat at the table and a voice in this, because in a lot of ways, the greatest disservice in the system falls upon them, because they are the ones who have to deal with all these things, all these issues that we've decided to make criminal and a felony, and they are the face of it. They're now in schools, they're truant officers, they're social workers, they're dealing with just everything on the streets, and it's created a lot of points of conflict. So I'm hopeful that law enforcement does have more of a voice here. I think they have had some voice, but they're not at the hearing today, to the General's point. I do know that this week there is a lot of activity around having law enforcement more engaged. There's going to be an event in D.C. The President is going to have an event at the White House with a number of law enforcement officials, and there's going to be like 150 law enforcement officials, attorneys general, police chiefs, sheriff's deputies, prosecutors, et cetera, in D.C. tomorrow for a press conference to announce their support of prison and sentencing reform. And I've talked to some number of different law enforcement groups, and a lot of them are very comfortable with what's in there. They're not going to support everything, and I totally respect and appreciate their point of view. I've got friends and family in law enforcement, and so having them on board is important. But I guess at the end of the day, I really feel somewhat confident that the reforms we're talking about in the Senate bill are going to be, they're historic for sure. They're going to really help people improve their lives and do a lot of good for this country. And really hope and pray, obviously, it doesn't increase crime. And I think based on the experiences in the states, which are driving a lot of this, I feel very comfortable on that, but time will tell.
General, at the National Constitution Center, our motto is visit, learn, debate, and it sounds like there may be some debate among conservatives on this issue. I said that Lee Otis, who worked for you, the founder of the Federalist Society, is the chair of our Coalition on Freedom Advisory Board, and her husband, Bill Otis, speaking recently at a Federalist Society event, said, 2 facts about crime and sentencing dwarf everything else we've learned in the past 50 years. When we have more prisons, we have less crime, and when we have less prisons, we have more crime. Might some conservatives get off the boat when it comes to sentencing reform?
Well, I think that is true. I know Bill Otis, who's Lee Otis's husband, is very much concerned about this, and he's the type of person I'd like to see in these hearings, explaining to the Congress what his concerns are, and people like him who've studied this. He was very active in the Department of Justice and is kind of an expert in this field. But there's one thing about the bill that's now going through, apropos of our discussion today, and that is the one thing they left out is the prevention of over-criminalization. And it seems to me if you're having a wholesale change in the laws pertaining to criminal penalties, that going back to the initial step, and that is having less bad laws that criminalize ordinary conduct, really ought to be a part of this bill if it isn't truly going to be an omnibus bill. I just hope that the kinds of things that we've been talking about today, and that is eliminating over-criminalization, becomes as urgent a matter for Congress to take up in the future.
Great. Mark, I want the National Constitution Center to be central to this debate going forward and to be a convening space that will focus especially on the constitutional reforms. And the group Justice Reform, Fix Criminal Justice that you've supported has circulated to all of you a series of proposed reforms, some of which have to do with the Constitution. You talked about requiring criminal intent and knowledge standards, protecting the accused in grand juries, protecting Sixth Amendment rights for fair representation, and tell me more specifically about the constitutional reforms that you think are necessary to address this problem, and what can the National Constitution Center do to help make them possible?
Well, I think that we need to honor the Bill of Rights. I think the Constitution has it right, and I don't think a lot of what we're doing is honoring that right now, particularly, as General Meese pointed out, our criminal laws, the number of criminal laws we have and the type of behavior that it criminalizes without intent standards. I think that's not appropriate. I think we need to fix that. I personally, no disrespect to any prosecutors at all, I mean that. I want to get out of here today. But no, in all seriousness, look, I think most prosecutors get it right, do the job selflessly, great public servants. But a lot of what I think prosecutors don't like about this is going to be a power shift a little bit. They've got an enormous amount of power right now. And, you know, no one likes to lose power. I don't have a whole lot, but I know when I lose it, I don't like it. And I think that's what we're seeing, somewhat of the pushback here. I do think that our criminal justice system, again, is the best in the world. But I think the grand jury process, we really need to look at that closely. What happens in the grand jury? I think there need to be reforms. I think that, in my opinion, the accused should not have to waive their right, Fifth Amendment right of self-incrimination in order to present evidence in a grand jury. They should allow the lawyer for the accused, the target, I guess it would be more appropriate because the target of the grand jury investigation before the grand jury indicts to put in evidence of innocence. Let him call witnesses, him or her call witnesses. I think prosecutors should do that more. I'm sure some do. I think there should be more open file discovery. That's the Brady case, which is a Supreme Court case. Again, there's a lot of mischief, what's material, what isn't. I'm not faulting most prosecutors, but there's so much at stake here. The individual against the government who is trying to take away his or her life, liberty, or property, all ties should go to the accused. They should get access to this information. I know that prosecutors I've talked to worry because there could be higher valued people, confidential informants exposed. My response is then don't indict me till you work that out. I mean, I'm supposed to, okay, well, I get it now. You want to go after someone else, so I won't look at any of this and get all the files I need to protect myself. I don't think that works. That needs to be reformed. Sixth Amendment, criminal defense, indigent defense issues. We are not honoring the promise of the Gideon case and the promise of the Sixth Amendment that the accused will have counsel in a criminal case in a meaningful way. It's just not happening, and I don't think it's intentional. There's just not enough money, not enough time, not enough resources. And public defenders do an amazing job. They're to be applauded, but there aren't enough of them, and they have way too many cases. We need to find a way to fund that. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe part of it is reducing the size of the prison population in a safe way so you can spend more on defense issues. The evidence-based sentencing, that type of thing, that's a statutory issue as well. And then lastly, the reentry and collateral consequence issues. That's easing some of the restrictions on people coming back, but that, at the end of the day, a lot of that's going to have to do with communities being comfortable, opening their hearts and minds, and trying to give people a second chance when they return. One last thing I'd like to say on that, to General Meese's point about if you're a small business owner and you can't take the risk, I do think legislatures may be able to help here. I know I just said government needs to try to get out of the way, but there's one thing they might be able to do is to have some legislation that allowed an employer who exercised reasonable due diligence, did all the checks, and hired someone with a criminal record, because a lot of people are afraid, what if I hire them and something happens? I'm going to get sued, I'm a small business owner, I'm going to be out of business. I think if there was some way to give them some limited immunity in that situation, that might be helpful as well. So that's something to happen. But anyway, I think the bottom line is that everything we need is in our Bill of Rights and in the Constitution. We know what to do. We're good people, we're just people, and I think we'll get there. And the fact that we're all talking about this today at a time when the dysfunction and polarization in Washington is going to be at all-time high. You've got Senator Grassley working with Senator Leahy. You've got Senator Booker. You've got Tim Scott. You've got Cornyn, you name it, Durbin, White House. That says a lot, and I think that's progress. And my hope would be this would not be the only issue that they can work on in a bipartisan way, because there's a lot more that needs to get fixed in our system. And a lot of stuff that comes out of D.C. isn't great, but this type of stuff will help people improve their lives, and then let the communities take care of the rest. That's my view.
That is great. General Meese, last word to you. Everything we need to know is in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Do you agree with Mark about some of those constitutional points, and why is it important to reform the criminal justice system moving forward?
I think that I agree with much of what he says, particularly grand jury reform. I come from California, where they have the one thing they do right there is the grand jury system, where the accused does get a fair shake. They get a verbatim transcript of the grand jury proceedings, and they have the chance to quash the indictment if the prosecution has done wrong things, such as admitted evidence before the grand jury that is not proper, or where they have not provided safeguards for the accused. So I think that the federal grand jury system really does need considerable reform. I was surprised when I became in the Justice Department that it was inferior to some of the states in terms of those protections. But I think if you look at the whole system, we have basically a good system. We have, for the most part, a fair system, but we can have a better system. And the thing I would hope that this group would take away from here is the fact that your involvement in the criminal justice system through your legislators at the state level, through your legislators at the federal level, can have a lot of persuasion, a lot of influence on them to do the right thing in these cases. And that becomes very important. And ultimately, the way in which we improve the criminal justice system so we have fewer crimes and that we have more people who do commit crimes not repeating their crimes, we're going to have a much safer community. And the kinds of things we've talked about today, I think, lead us in that direction.
Well, that is great. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give the last word to our hosts, but you've heard a call to action from our guests, and I'm going to leave you with one as well. I want you to educate yourselves about these issues. You have an obligation as citizens to study them so you can make up your own mind and participate in this great bipartisan debate. Don't only read the Constitution itself, begin with the text, but go online. You can now do it on your phones. Go to the interactive Constitution, constitutioncenter.org. You can look at all of the amendments that Mark Holden and General Meese talked about and hear the best scholars on both sides talking about what they agree about and what they disagree about, and then you can decide what you think needs to be reformed. This is one of the greatest privileges of citizenship that we all have, making up our minds about what the Constitution means and being united in these polarized times, both by the great bipartisan effort around this issue and by this beautiful document of freedom that unites us, the U.S. Constitution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
For you.
Thank you.
As always, we have a gift for our speakers, a scholarship in their name to junior achievement for the coming year. We thank you for joining us. It was a wonderful discussion. I hope it'll keep going this afternoon among all of you and into the future. I'll see you all on November 9th for our next luncheon. Thanks for being here today. Thank you. Thanks so much. It was wonderful.